Hello, everyone. All right, we're going to get started now. Thank you for your patience. To those joining us live stream, thank you for your patience. My name is Cheryl Flores. I'm the Director of Community Engagement with Advance Illinois. For those of you who aren't familiar with Advance Illinois, we are a nonprofit bipartisan organization focused on education policy and advocacy work at the state level. And we are a core member of the Coalition for Transforming Higher Education Funding. So on behalf of the coalition, I want to welcome you and thank you for attending today's session on the adequate and equitable funding formula. So today's time with us will consist of a presentation on the adequate and equitable funding formula organization focused on education policy and advocacy work at the state level. And we are a core member of the Coalition for Transforming Higher Education Funding. So on behalf of the coalition, I want to welcome you and thank you for attending today's session on the adequate and equitable funding formula. So today's time with us will consist of a presentation on the adequate and equitable. There we go. That's really awkward hearing yourself in an auditorium setting. So again, thank you for joining us. For those of you who didn't get an opportunity, who are with us in person, there are resources outside. Hopefully you had an opportunity to walk through that data walk that highlights a lot of the data that you'll see today in the presentation. There's also one-pagers that you can take in terms of, following up with more opportunities for advocacy. Hopefully after today, we can count on you for those advocacy opportunities. I also want to thank the SIU community for opening your doors and bringing us on board for today's presentation. And with that being said, I do want to welcome President Mahoney here to offer a few remarks before we get started.
Well, thank you. And,
we can count on you for those advocacy opportunities.
Wow,
I also want to thank
delay.
the SIU community.
Okay, so that's a little bit better. So Dan Mahoney, I'm president of the SIU system. I want to thank the coalition for being here and doing this presentation for our alumni. I want to thank all of you for participating, either if you're here in person or virtually. We appreciate that involvement. Just I want to give you a little bit of insight from an SIU perspective. We've been very involved with this from the very beginning. I served on the commission, the Higher Education Funding Formula Commission, and as well as the technical working group, which means I was very much involved with the weeds of actually determining how this was going to work. I'm a former accountant, so give me a spreadsheet and I'm happy for hours. So this was actually something I truly actually enjoyed, and being part of this process has been really great. I will say as we went through it, there were a number of suggestions we had that we felt were necessary for us to support it, recognizing some of the things that are unique about SIU Carbondale. There's support, for example, that we're a Research One university that increases the support. We have medical education, which is extraordinarily expensive for those who don't realize that. That needed to be accounted for accurately and adequately. The number of other things, our graduate programs and how our students pay or don't pay and all of that had to be factored into it. I will say working with the advocacy groups as well as the rest of the commission, and the legislators who support this, Representative Ammons and Leader Lightford, they were very open to those suggestions. And so everything that I asked for to be changed actually ultimately was changed. And so I think it's a formula that does well from an SIU perspective, but also from a statewide perspective. And what I like about this formula, and I liked from the beginning, I think I liked what it was trying to do philosophically always, which was it really tried to look at what is necessary to fund education at an adequate level and achieve the results we want to achieve for the students that we have at each institution, recognizing that student body is different across institutions. So what does it actually take to accomplish our goals? It does it in, a very equitable way, and does it in a way, at least we're trying to do it in a way that makes it more predictable, which I will say as a higher ed leader is one of the biggest challenges we have, every year is a new adventure, and we have no idea what our increase in funding is going to be. If we could have more predictability, that would help us do a lot more long-range planning, which is challenging right now. So in my mind, even when I had some of the concerns, I was always supportive of the philosophy behind it. I will also say this is the first model in the country to do it this way. So this is unique in the United States, which means, again, it's a little bit more challenging because no one has done this quite yet. Part of the reason why it's taken us 4 years to get to this point. But we've put the time in, I think, to develop a model that I think will work not just for SIU, but for the state of Illinois and across higher education institutions. So I am strongly supportive and have been for the last year and continue to be an advocate for it. So again, I just want to give you some perspective on how we got here and as well as the SIU perspective. But I'm going to turn it over to the coalition so that they can now give you a more detailed explanation, but I'll be around after they present to answer any questions you may have specifically for me.
All right. Thank you, President Mahoney, for those remarks and perspective. So with our time together, here is our agenda for today. So again, I'm going to invite my colleague over to provide that presentation. Afterwards, there will be an opportunity for question and answers. And then lastly, a few opportunities for advocacy after this. This piece of legislation is live in the General Assembly, and so from now until the end of May, there's going to be several opportunities to plug in, and want to share some of those with you before you leave today. And again, we'll be here for any questions afterwards, but again, thank you for coming. And with that being said, I want to invite my colleague, Jelani Sadiq. He's the Director of Government Relations with Advance Illinois.
Well, pick this up some. Good evening. We can do better than that. This is higher education funding. Everybody likes that. Good evening. Good evening. All right, good. Well, as Cheryl said, my name is Jelani Sadiq. I am the Director of Government Relations here at Advance Illinois, and it's truly a privilege to be with you all today here in person and those who are streaming online. The goal of this conversation is to bring you more information about what is happening here in the state of Illinois when it comes to true reform for higher education funding. This is not an easy topic. This is not a topic that just a fly-by-night thing. This is something that has been taking place for almost 3.5 years now, I would say. This is very thoughtful level of conversation that every single university, even one who may not be the happiest right now, but that could be a question for another time, have all been able to engage in. This also includes the Board of Higher Education. We also had conversations about where does ISAC fit into this conversation? We talk about MAP funding and those type of things. But today I just want to make sure I can give you a very broad overview of what this formula is and how we got there. So this is the kind of birth child, honestly, of work that came out of the Black Caucus Education Pillar Bill back in 2021. So if you remember back during that time, the country was facing some very tough and hard questions, as we find ourselves in many times. And the Black Caucus here in the state of Illinois decided to answer that question with various pillars: education, economic development, criminal justice, all types of different topics. But for the specific one of education, they broke it up between early childhood, K-12, and higher ed. The higher education conversation was not just about university operational funds, it also included workforce development. How can we move higher education to the next level? However, for the sake of today's conversation, there was a commission that was established out of that bill that brought together all of the stakeholders in the state of Illinois, from advocate organizations, the governor's office, the Board of Higher Ed, and of course all of our institutions. We also included the union representation in that commission to really have a thoughtful level of conversation to say, if we were to transform appropriations, what would that look like? At first, it wasn't the product that we had today. We looked at various models, things that other states are doing. Other experts came in, brought their opinions. So it was very high-level, detailed conversations that happened during this time. Now, skipping ahead a little bit, Leader Lightfoot in the Senate and Representative Emmons in the House, they have both filed their pieces of legislation that came out of the negotiations for this bill. That is Senate Bill 13 currently in the Senate, and House Bill 1581 that you see in the, here in the House under Representative Emmons. House Bill 1581, if you all read the news or got the notifications from the university, was just heard in the Higher Education Appropriation Committee in the House. President Mahoney was there to show his support of that initiative as well. but we will have a lot more conversations. Now let's get into some of the specifics. The reason that we're even having this conversation is because we know the current system just doesn't work. Having across-the-board increases for higher education institutions, specifically for their operational funds, does not make sense. So what we have today is basically a base plus model. This is this is whatever you got in the previous year, plus whatever political, climate, negotiations, or just feelings that people have decided that we're gonna give everybody a 3% increase, 2%, 10, whatever that number may be. Over the last several years, it's been closer to that 3 and below, honestly, and we need to change that. But what we know is that when you do that over time, you are not truly addressing the needs of that institution, and depending on what that increase is, you're not even keeping up with inflation. So some of the things that you all are seeing here on the campus is directly tied to how we deal with state appropriations, which is one of the main reasons why we want to make this change. And depending, of course, whatever new changes are happening nationally and those type of things, the current model doesn't adjust for that. When you have drastic shifts of enrollment, we don't adjust for that. When you're trying to deal with deferred maintenance, the operational fund and how we do our current system does not take that into approach. So this here, really simple graphic, hopefully. But this one, what we're trying to show is what is the historical precedent to have this conversation? What do we see nationally versus what's happening in Illinois? So this, I don't know if I have a pointer. Nevertheless, this slide, this particular graph on this side is just showing that we as Illinois are not keeping up with the national average. The top line is showing what people are generally appropriating our university nationally versus what we see here in Illinois. The sad reality is that we have had such a downturn of appropriations for higher education for more than 20 plus years. And that's something you feel each and every day. That is not a pie in the sky type of concept. It is a on the ground feeling because higher education has been used as one of those things that you can just cut. When times get hard, we can cut higher ed. We look at it more as a business than just a public institution for the greater good of not only that community, but the students upon which they serve. And that must change. Now, the slide on the other side is trying to give a little bit of a different level of rationale. Now, this rationale shows you is that as state appropriations decline, tuition goes up. Higher education institutions are not K-12 public schools. They do not rely on a tax base to then pull resources from, right? You're not leveraging taxes from that perspective, but you do have tuition and fees. So if state appropriations go down, and we see what happened when we were in the budgeted pass, that's why you have that major dip there, the tuition had to raise. We had to find that money from somewhere, and that's what typically has made Illinois one of the most unaffordable public higher education systems in the country. And now, because we look at this disinvestment, we're trying to figure out, like, what do we need to do? How can we better show the relationship between how it's affecting all of our institutions? There is not a single institution that is not being negatively affected by this current system. And just this current fiscal year, we're actually approaching the next fiscal year, the General Assembly appropriated a 3% increase under the current model to our institutions of higher education. However, within that agreement, the budget, the governor was able to withhold a percentage of that funding just depending on what happened on a federal level. There is a lot of instability currently on a federal level when it comes to higher education funding. There's a lot of changes to be happening. We won't dive into those today, but what we can say is that at least from the coalition's perspective, the university's perspective, we have truly been advocating for the release of that 2%. Because if the university only receives 1 from that agreement, we continue to bake in the inequities that we currently see, and we're not able to truly serve the student populations that we have, and a lot of universities have had to make some very tough decisions because of that lack of investment. And now here, we really just kind of want to show how that relationship, once again, is dealing with tuition and fees. Lack of state appropriations, over-reliance on tuition and fees. That has continued to be the model and conversation for far too long. And we believe, as we'll get in here in a moment, that we want to actually flip that a little bit. We want to start to put more of that burden on the state versus on the backs of families and students where we know one of the greatest barriers to higher education for so many families here in the state of Illinois and across the country is truly how much it costs. And that's something that we really do want to address. And now, because of that, we also have to look at What does that bachelor degree attainment look like? What does retention rate looks like? All of these things and concepts start to feed into one another based on the current resources available, because as budgets become more constrained, the lack of the ability of the institution, for example, to give out more financial aid scholarship from an institutional level. If there are major changes and fluctuations on a federal level, you start to see how those start to interact. But we really do want to kind of take some of that burden off so that we can increase retention and attainment. But also we know that those who are earning bachelor degrees are then able to feed into that economy greater than those who don't, right? That is the economy that Illinois has built. We are requiring more and more jobs to have a minimum of a bachelor's degree here in the state of Illinois. So if that's going to be the requirement of the economy, then we must support our institutions of higher education so that we can fill that job market. Now this slide here is really just kind of showing you, now let's take it a little bit deeper. Now, these are two institutions that we just kind of pulled. We didn't want to name any, but we're looking at that per student spend. The resources available that an institution can use to invest in that student. Academic and non-academic supports, the various programming that your institution may have, a lot of that boils down to the amount of resources that you have. But this is not a new problem. So we're showing what it looked like in 2014 for a smaller institution versus a larger, which then, because of our current system, continue to bake in that same problem, and is just now exacerbating over time. And this is something that we truly have to change, especially those who are have institutions where their students may need additional resources, like students who have come from agriculture or rural communities, students of color, or low-income students, first generation as well. Now, in order to do this and make these increases as necessary, we want to look at every single aspect of this continuum. We want to look at not only the enrollment, right? We can bring in more freshmen, we can bring in more transfer students, et cetera, but then we need them to stay. What are then the investments necessary for those students to stay? How are you dealing with transfer portals for those coming from community colleges? Or how we, as I was just talking to the president about, sending out recruiters to high schools and having to pay for those expenses as well. But then you have to look at the completion. So we need to ensure that once we bring a student to campus, we're not only enrolling them, we're providing the resources necessary so that they can persist and retain, and then, of course, that completion side. Now, let's get into the actual formula and how it works. So as we were going through the commission report, there was various things and levels that we wanted to address. We wanted to make sure that the resource being distributed to the universities was adequate. But what does that idea of adequacy mean? We have to be able to define that. We wanted to ensure that it was equitable. That means that we're not trying to make sure that everybody got billions of dollars. That's not necessarily the concept here. The concept here is to ensure that everyone has the resources that they need to address their student populations, fulfill their mission and goals, and ensure that every student that comes to their campus is successful. So that means that everyone we have to look at based on their unique situation, where they are in the state, the student population that they have, et cetera. So it won't be equal, it'll be equitable. And then, of course, it needs to be stable. One of the major issues that we just started this conversation off with is the instability that currently exists within the current model here in the state. You may get 3%, you may get 1%, we don't know, we're not sure until May 31st, and then you gotta scramble to kind of put your budgets together, and that is no fun for anyone. But under this model, we wanted to be able to put in a number that the General Assembly would know that every single year, this is what we have to shoot for. Similar in K through 12, in the EBF formula, we put in $350 million annually. That is a number that the General Assembly can bank on, and as they're dealing with their revenue projections and other things, they can account for that already. Higher ed is not in that conversation, and that needs to change. Therefore, we are advocating under this current model for $135 million annually that the General Assembly can then begin to bank on, so that every year they know, and then universities know with some level of certainty what they may be receiving before the budget time comes, makes budgeting process here at the university a lot better, and of course, program expansion and addressing the needs of the students become a lot clearer. But then lastly, I work for Advance Illinois. I don't work for an institution. I have to be honest about that. It is very difficult for me to go into a legislator's office and say, hey, you need to appropriate $135 million to all of our institutions. They're gonna tell me why. Why would I do that? Under this current system, we have no sense of knowing where the dollars go. How do we ensure that taxpayers feel comfortable with that? Like, there are lots of very reasonable questions that a legislator is going to ask me, even though I'm trying to advocate for what I believe is the right thing to do. However, this model takes that in mind. For the first time, we are actually going to transform the system of its entirety, not just appropriations and how you spend it, but we're actually gonna look in and put in accountability and transparency measures so that the General Assembly, the general public, all have an idea of how the institutions are now better spending their funds. There's a level of accountability and transparency for the folks who work at the institution to know how that's working. And of course, there is a model and different measurements within this formula that says that, hey, you can't just spend it on one thing. We gave you additional $20 million this year, just throwing that number out. It just can't go to the auditorium. Like, we have to be able to address the other needs of the institution, and that level of transparency we just don't truly have in this system currently. I think of course there are accounting measures and ISLs that are printed, but we really want to transform that and make it clear for everyone. And so that's one thing that we really did take a lot of time to break down. Now, looking at how we put it together, this will not show you exactly all the complexities of what it takes to run an institution, but what it is trying to show you is how we put the formula to work from a mathematical perspective, or more importantly, how do we find the adequacy gap? That is something that you're gonna hear a lot. Adequacy gap this, we're only at 47%, we only at 64%. This is how we actually find that number. The first step is, we gotta figure out how much it costs to run the institution. What is the academic supports, where is the deferred maintenance look like? What is the actual mission and vision of the institution? There are lots of different things. How much do these programs cost versus this program? I can just remember during the negotiations, as President Mahoney alluded to earlier, high cost programs. A liberal arts department does not cost the same as the engineering department. So we can't measure them the same. So how does that interact within the formula? Or even then, what about medical school? How do we look at pharmacy and dentistry? Those high cost programs are all accounted for here, and there's measures and variables and all types of mathematical configurations to kind of put together how much that costs. But then we have to look at what is the current resources of the institution. Now, in the original bill, if you all had ever had an opportunity to look at that, it's a lot more expanded than what we currently have. Based on those negotiations, it made sense. For example, in the original bill, there was a topic of endowment. I don't know if that's something that folks have heard previously, but that was taken out during the negotiation process. So one thing that we really did want to do is, of course, listen to our institutions and say, when we're looking at your current resources, how do we better account for it? So now here, we're really having that conversation about what is your current appropriations from the state, and then how do we look at tuition and fees, right? Those very huge parts of the puzzle really have to be accounted for in the right way, because one thing that we want to do is drive down tuition cost. What is the burden on families? How do we make Illinois public higher education a lot more affordable? But we have to start by knowing what is the current resources of the institution. So after we figure out how much it costs for to run the programs, the academics, the deferred maintenance, and all that other stuff, we then have to look at the resource profile. Where is the tuition fees? What is the current appropriations from the state? Things that we are not including, for example, are grants. Grants are not included in a part of this conversation. We really just want to look at the localized funds for the institution. And once you calculate that, that's how you get your adequacy gap. That's how you show, well, we only have 50% of what we need. We should be spending this much per student, but we're only able to spend this. And the adequacy gap and how we fill it with this new funding is a means to be able to address that financial problem. Now, as we were just kind of breaking down here, this just kind of gives you a little more details to how we look at those, the adequacy components. Of course, things like your enrollment, the diversity of your population, all of those things are a part of that calculation. There are certain things that we have to remove out of the original bill because we want to make sure it can withstand constitutional scrutiny. So those type of very difficult conversations was had, but of course, how we look at, the cost to deal with first-generation students. There are various programming that happen for student support services. All of those things are a part of this conversation. And then, of course, just kind of breaking down that resource profile idea. We just wanted to make sure people had a very clear picture that we're really just looking at your state appropriations and your tuition and fees. And on the tuition side, it's called net tuition revenue, because the institution does give out scholarships. So what is the actual amount of money that students are spending to their institution for whatever that cost is? So it may cost, let's say, $5,000 to attend for the student, but then the institution gives you $3,000, therefore you're only really paying $2,000. We want to capture that $2,000 amount because the $3,000 has already been spent out by the institution. That's not revenue actually coming in, and that's something that we had to be very cautious of and when calculating, because we don't want to double count things, and then we don't want to underestimate what's actually being brought in to the institution. And then lastly, just to hit on one more time, this adequacy gap conversation is quite important because how the formula is very dynamic. So each and every year that the General Assembly appropriates new funds to the institution, that adequacy target changes. And the goal is to get everyone to full funding, right? That is the goal for every institution in the state of Illinois, to get to full funding. And that's why the adequacy percentage is very important in this conversation, but it also gives you a very clear picture that, one, you all are doing an amazing job. I think that's first and foremost. The fact that these institutions have been able to run at such a high level, knowing they only have half of what they need, is a huge part of this conversation, but it's not to necessarily diminish the work of the institution. It's really to bring it up. We're showing that we are making good. This is not a wasteful thing to do, but what we need to do is actually appropriate the money to the institutions that they need. And so now, just to kind of hone in a little bit, when you're looking at the distribution side, those who are furthest from adequacy, right, they're going to get a major increase in their appropriation. Those who are closer to adequacy, the increase, although they will get an increase, will be a little bit smaller. That is that equity component. If you have 98% of what you need, that percentage of, or that nominal amount, or that percentage of money for your adequacy gap will be a lot different than those who have 30% of what they need. And if we're trying to get everyone to full funding within a specific amount of time, between 10 to 15 years, we have to ensure that the distribution mechanism is in such a way that the money will go out to those who are furthest from adequacy, and then, of course, those who have more resources will get new funding, but the percentages now change because of how we deal with the more equitable model versus our everybody's treated the same across the board model. So now this here really just gives you a clear picture of where our institutions are. One thing I do want to point out is that as we was running this model, we wanted to ensure that we had adequacy percentages for each and every institution. So even though you may be a part of SIU's system, we wanted to show where UIC was. We wanted to show where, UIC versus UIS. We wanted to show where SIUC is versus SIUE, right? All of these various institutions, they do have different needs. They have different student populations and all those type of things. So we wanted to make sure that the formula took that into account. And even though the system would be the ones to, I don't want to use the word inherit, but get the money and then spread it out to the institution, we do want to ensure that everyone is being taken care of based on how they fall within the formula. I kind of spoke to this a little bit earlier. We are advocating for that $135 million. The goal is to get everyone to full funding in between 10 to 15 years. Now, $135 million may sound like a lot of money, because it probably is. But the truth of the matter is that this is what we need to ensure that we are keeping up with inflation, right? Because inflation is a real factor that we have to think about. So we're keeping up with inflation, and we are able to ensure that each and every institution here in the state of Illinois, their appropriation is above inflation, right? So not only keeping up with, but we want to make sure each and every institution here in the state are receiving appropriations above inflation. So just as we talked about earlier, the General Assembly only appropriated 3% across the board, but the governor withheld 2%. That means we're not keeping up with inflation. We wanted to have a number that did both of those things. But then secondly, we need to begin to shift that burden from the student to deal with the cost to the state. That is how we make this system as a whole more affordable. And shifting that burden is a very conscious effort. And that's one thing that we as advocates are very adamant about, and institutions as a whole. President Mahoney has said it several times. We want to become more affordable. We want to make sure that everyone has access to our institutions. And in order for us to do that, it has to come with some level of commitment from our General Assembly. And we believe by putting together a model upon which they can rely on that is more transparent, they'll be more comfortable in doing so. And now this here, I won't go through all of them, but the goal is to be able to show you what the appropriation for the universities will look like. And for those who can't read it out, I'll just read off one of the numbers just for SIUC. In that first year of appropriations with $135 million, we're looking at additional like $10 million, for example, for one of the campuses. For another, it'd be about $13 million. But that's just, like I said, looking at for the FY26 increase if we were to do that. We also wanted to show here what was actually recommended within the status quo, not 3% increase, versus what was actually given with the 1% appropriation. So this is just to kind of show you what would have happened in our current fiscal year if we would have been able to get this done last year. But we're still moving this thing forward and making it happen. But it's a long road ahead, but it's something that we can definitely do. And I believe that the General Assembly is taking this quite serious. But before I move on, one thing that we do want to just kind of stress, I don't know if folks can see it on this side, but MAP and financial aid. The $135 million is by no means to be used to take away financial aid initiatives. Like, that is not the purpose here. We actually believe that you need both better operational spending from the institution as well as financial aid. As we said, we're trying to shift the burden. We want to make sure that we're also supporting the other magnificent tools that the state has to help address affordability. And MAP is one of those things. So just because we're pushing for $135 million does not mean that we're suggesting that you do not have to support MAP funding. That is not the conversation we're having here today. Financial aid is just as important to the system as a whole and ensuring that this ecosystem works as intended. So I just wanted to make sure we stress that the $135 million for the operations of universities is not a means to eliminate MAP, because we really do still need financial aid initiatives like MAP, Teachers of Illinois, various other scholarship programs that the state operates. And now here, so this slide in particular just kind of shows you from a year 0 to 10-year change in percentages for all of our institutions. With this in mind, we just wanted to show kind of the importance of having this more equitable distribution model. But with that being said, we've had pretty much like a 3-point-something% average over the last 5 years. And under this, you would show how much of an increase the institutions would receive under the new model by year 10. Next, just to make sure I can hit on this one, we talked about earlier the importance of accountability and transparency. So I just kind of want to give a couple very brief things. One, there will be things called expenditure reports that the universities would have to provide to the Board of Higher Education and General Assembly. These reports would actually show in a much clearer way how are the new dollars being spent. We're spending it on support services, we're spending on deferred maintenance, we're spending on this and on that. But then a legislator asked me actually not too long ago, well, Jelani, fine, they say they're gonna spend it this way, but then say they don't do it. What happens then? We actually put in accountability measures that then are triggered if a university, for whatever reason within their spending plans or others, are not spending the resource appropriately. The Board of Higher Education would then send it back to them and say, hey, before we have to take this to the General Assembly, we ask that you revise your spending plans. That, of course, becomes a huge public thing. I know folks on the university level will have their comments to say about how the university decided to spend this new spending. And then lastly, if they just ignored all of that, the General Assembly can then decide to withhold new funding to that institution. We do not have that type of mechanism currently in place, and we wanted to ensure that if we're going to go out and ensure that taxpayers feel comfortable spending this increased appropriation, that it comes with a level of transparency and accountability that they can rely on, And quite frankly, I think the General Assembly members are more happy about that, knowing that they actually have a mechanism to hold universities accountable for the increase of appropriations. And then here, we really just want to show with this level of investment, just the sheer amount of impact that these dollars can make here in the state of Illinois. We know that students are more likely to stay around institutions that they went to school at or stay in a state that they went to school at, which of course then bolsters the economy and does a lot of other things. We in the state of Illinois, I'm sure many of you have heard, we're running into some budget issues. But one of the greatest ways, you can't tax your way out of certain problems. We know this to be true. But one thing you can do is find creative ways to expand that economy. And one of those expansion means is to graduate more folks, get them opportunities here in the state of Illinois, where they then are adding to the economy upon which you have invested in them. And that's one of the major driving factors that we believe that this is important, and we want to ensure that every single student in the state of Illinois, if they so choose, has access to an affordable, high-quality higher education experience here in the state of Illinois without having to go to other states because they said it was just cheaper. That should no longer be the case if we put in measures like this to actually address that affordability. Now here, really quickly, I know my timekeepers are getting at me right now, but one thing we just want to show, like, what does this look like for SIU, right? I know we saw some of the numbers earlier. We saw the distribution percentages earlier, but as I was talking to folks before we started, SIUC, for example, is very important to this entire region. What happens to this institution being an economic driver and so many other things, being that one access point for a university for miles, almost close to 2 hours for some people, depending on where you live here in the state, SIU is that place for you. And we want to ensure that those students know that SIU will be affordable, they have access to the institution, and they don't have to cross state lines going down to Kentucky or Missouri or Indiana to get a high-quality, affordable higher education experience when SIU has the resources necessary to be here, and definitely being one of the few institutions here in the state that really serves a rural population. The needs of those students are a lot different than those who are coming from more urban populations, and we want to ensure that that is accounted for. Next, we want to ensure that within this formula, we are dealing with that retention and attainment rate. We know that there are some challenges that SIU, but SIU is not unique in this. There's challenges in higher education across the country when you look at attainment, you look at enrollment and other things. And we want to ensure that we are turning the tide on that, but ways that we do that is truly investing in those students. And so here, we just kind of wanted to provide you some figures about how it's kind of impacting SIU right now based on the current standing that we see. And then, of course, just for the system here for SIU, we've seen that appropriations have fallen almost 30% for the institution. That is unacceptable, in my opinion. You all have a beautiful campus here. Today's actually my first day being on this campus, and we need to address those problems. And not that you all haven't done a great job at what you do, but the goal is that we know that there's a gap. We know that the state of Illinois, what they should be spending, and now it's up to us to go out there and advocate for it because we have great institutions like this one. And then, of course, with this declining enrollment and all these other things or persistence, you then have a drain in the area. Coming from a rural area like this, Illinois is not a small state. So as people start to leave, especially from the southern portion of the state and go into other, states and those type of things, the Kentuckys, Missouris of the world, it will be felt. You'll see it. It's in the classrooms. It's in the economy. And we really do want to help address that because we know that the feeling is real. So some of this I'm kind of going to skip over a little bit. But one thing we did just kind of want to show is some of that economic impact that SIU brings to the state of Illinois. We wanted to show you what the current standing is, but then what the future could be. We believe with these investments, we'll be bringing more students to campus because college will be more affordable. We'll have the resources on those campuses to actually address the student populations upon which you're bringing. And then, of course, as you're retaining those students, you're then graduating more students, which then will add to the state economy. So going from $151 million in tax impact, we'll be looking at something closer to $201 million. This is real return on investment that the state of Illinois can do now that then expands and addresses some of the budget issues that we find here in the state versus some of the other options. Higher education is one of few places that you get that return on investment a lot faster than some of the other things that you support and appropriate to. And this here shows SIUEs. I won't spend too much time on that one. Oh, no, it wasn't, okay. No, I wasn't doing that joke, okay? I wasn't doing that joke, but you laughed, so I'm gonna take it. We really just kind of wanted to hit this home. As we said earlier, $135 million annually is a lot of money. But again, that return on investment is worth it. You will see it, you will feel it. The state of Illinois will be able to then support other things that they deem as important, right? The budget is a document of our priorities and our values. Higher education has to be one of those. And so hopefully you've enjoyed this. I wanted to just kind of give a quick overview, but now we want to switch over to questions. Hopefully you don't have any because I just explained it all, but President Mahoney will join me if you had anything specific for the institution, and prayerfully I wasn't talking too fast as we kind of went through this, but I really do appreciate it. Thank you. Any questions anyone may have? Yes, sir.
I just have one, because I know the trend here is for a lot more online. And how is that going to impact graduation? Say they're online from Minnesota.
That makes sense. President Mahoney?
Yeah, it's on our.
This one is.
All right. So the question is about moving to online education and kind of what that does to students and where they may end up. And I will say there's a broad range of online students. So for example, one of the things we have is the Saluki Step Ahead program, which includes relationships with pretty much every community college in the state of Illinois, which allows them to finish their last 2 years in that location. But that also means they're across the state of Illinois. So a lot of those online students actually are in the state. I think there's always the perception with online students is they tend to go across states. They actually tend to go to institutions closer to where they're actually from. That's just kind of the pattern that we see. So they are actually much more likely, even with the online students, to stay in the state of Illinois. So that's, again, just what we know from kind of looking at some of our data, but also the national data. Yes.
My name is Stephen Hackett. I got my bachelor's degree in rehabilitation college to fight for the rights of people with disabilities. So thank you for that.
Thank you for saying that.
My regards to Dr. Bennett.
Yes, we will do that. That is actually, I will tell you, before I even got to SIU Carbondale, that is one of the programs I knew about because people I work with, rehab counseling and other institutions knew how good the program was here. So it's nice to hear you say that, but I've heard that for a long period of time, and we're proud of that program.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but 40% of SIU Carbondale students, first generation, is that accurate?
Sounds about right,
Yeah, I
yeah.
believe so.
I will say first generation is always hard to define, but depending on how you define it, that's pretty close to, I think, what's true.
I'm one of them. I came here
Yeah.
in the mid-70s. I came here specifically because I had a great radio TV.
Yeah.
Mhm.
From Saluki, I moved back to Carbondale 4 years ago. I believe higher education served by these trends. What's the possibility of this coalition actually getting the legislation fund on those proposals?
I love that you asked.
I'll let him start. And then there, yeah, good.
So the possibility of getting this done is truly dependent on a couple variables. One is depending on the amount of groundswell that we're able to create. I'm gonna just be honest. It is not easy to reform systems. And I truly don't use the word reform lightly in this conversation. Higher education funding hasn't changed in, I can't say how long because I wasn't alive for it. But what I can say is that legislators are asking me, who cares about this? Right? They really do need to hear from the citizens and their constituents because this year they're going to have to make a lot of tough decisions. But what I can tell you is just the last week, if I'm not mistaken, we were able to get the bill out of committee for the first time in the House. That changes people's perception and conversation. We need to ensure that leadership is taking this serious. The Speaker of the House, the Senate President, they have sat down with us on numerous occasions, trying to ensure that they understand what we're trying to do, what is the mechanics of this, and quite frankly, how do we pay for it? Which then is, of course, this third conversation. I believe in order to get this done, there will have to be the Senate President called it a mortgage agreement, right? Similar to higher education. We're signing up for something that we're going to pay for the next 50 years, let's just say that. With that, I think the General Assembly right now suggests that there must be some revenue options connected to it. I cannot today tell you what they will decide. We personally believe that the current budget could sustain something like this, but that would depend on the General Assembly making those decisions. If we've, let's just say on average, done between $30 to $38 million annually in appropriations for all of our institutions under the current system, we're looking for an additional 60 or 70. It's a lot easier to kind of grapple versus saying that we need a completely new 135. So we're saying if the General Assembly was already going to do another $38 million, then we need to find that gap in between. And I think those are the conversations that people are having now. So it is my opinion, because this is what I work on and I care about every day, that we can get this done this year. But it's truly going to depend on hearing from you all, quite frankly, calling your legislators saying you should be caring about this. Senator Fowler has been in several of those conversations. Senator Bryant has been in several of those conversations. But they need to hear from you. They need to hear as to why this could matter to you so much and how it could transform your institution.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think I've been involved with being university president now for 11 years, and begging for more money from the state is part of my job and has been part of my job for a long period of time, which you would think would instill a certain level of pessimism in me, and sometimes that is true. What I will say is that one of the things that I think I find positive here in Illinois is the fact that they redid K-12 funding just a few years ago with a very similar philosophy. So if you look at EBF, it really follows that kind of same type of approach to doing it. So they've already kind of done something similar to it. So again, to some extent, like Johnny talked about, it's finding the resources and them feeling they can have the resources. I find less resistance to the idea that this is a good idea. It's just finding the money to do it. And again, the EBF, I think, what is it, take 10 years to get done? I was saying the other day, I was a fan of Name That Tune when I was a kid. And I was like, I can do that in 5 years, not 10 years. I can name that tune in two notes or 5 notes. So I'm hoping to do it in less than 10 years. 5 years would be much better than 10 years. But I think that, again, as we're talking with legislators, philosophically, they're not opposed. I think it's figuring out and answering some of their questions maybe about, well, what about this versus that? I mean, some of the details in there, but I think we can deal with that too. But again, I think to Johnny's point is the support from people is critically important.
Yes, sir. So a lot of that information is based on current enrollment trends, upon which we, do the projections for. Now, I think when we get into the nuts and bolts of it, that will depend on the student. There are very non-traditional students that are incorporated in this conversation, transfer students who are part of this conversation, and how those transfer agreements happen between universities, community colleges. Like all of that will depend. A lot of this formula is dynamic, but based on current enrollment trends, that's kind of how we got some of the figures.
I'll just add one of the things that we've done really effectively across the state of Illinois, but particularly here in Carbondale, is reducing the cost for students over the last several years. So I think percentage of students who pay no tuition and fees who go to Illinois public universities who are from Illinois, grew up in Illinois, it was 24% in 2019. It's now 44%. So 44% pay nothing. At Carbondale, it's 46%. So we're getting close to half. What that means is it doesn't mean that there's no need among our students. It means the need tends to be on all of the other costs of attending, which we try to help out with as well. This is one of the ways we do that, and that's one of the ways I think a lot of students still prefer to be on campus and prefer that experience, but it's finding ways that they can cover those additional costs, and again, I think this can help us do that. Yeah.
Carbondale specifically.
I don't want to take away the chancellor's back there. And so you can shake your head yes or no if I say things, but again, I think it allows you to do a whole lot of things. So some of it is decrease the cost for students, which is critically important. But also part of this was based on the idea not just that those students coming from lower socioeconomic classes need to, in a situation where they're not taking on huge amounts of debt, but it's also that they have the support that they need to be successful. And I think part of what we would be able to do is provide more of those supports. It's interesting, I think if you look at what's happening nationally, we're starting to know what actually works in improving retention and graduation. The problem is finding enough money to do all of the things that we know works, and this would allow us to bring more of those kind of best practice programs to help our students to be successful, graduate at a high rate. We're already doing some of that, so we saw a jump in fall to spring retention here in Carbondale, about 2.5–3% this year, so we are doing some of it, but the more of those things we could do, I think the better success we would see for our students. So that would be certainly one thing. And I think it also allows us, one of the things I always found frustrating when I was a campus president before I was here is I would have these ideas for new programs and just not having the money to get them started, knowing that in the long term, they would be financially viable and actually beneficial to the institution. This would give us a little bit more money to be able to start new things, whether it's new academic programs, new student support programs, with the idea we know they'll pay off in the long run, but we need that upfront money to be able to do that.
And I think we have time for one more question.
There is a question in the live,
Sure.
Okay.
which ties into, I think, an earlier question, but they are wondering, what is the role of income taxes here in terms of funding the formula? Do you think that it would come from income taxes?
That's a very good question. Right now, what we're asking for is the increase of appropriation comes from the General Revenue Fund. Now, how all the taxes that pour into the General Revenue Fund then is a means for the General Assembly to distribute those funds based on the priorities of the state. Now, when we talk about revenues, a lot of those things are outside of the General Revenue Fund as a dedicated revenue stream. Now, it will be decided by the General Assembly how that happens. It is not my opinion that this will be tied to income taxes. I don't believe that's not a conversation I've had. I'm sure the presidents haven't had that conversation. We've only been asking for $135 million that we believe that the budget can sustain from the General Revenue Fund. And if the General Assembly decides to do something differently with a dedicated revenue stream, we'll kind of figure out what that is. I'm sure you all will find out, but there won't be a constitutional change to income taxes to get this done. At least that's not my opinion. There have been conversation about constitutional changes for income taxes, but I have not been tied to this work.
Yeah, and I would just add that we haven't talked about increases in the income tax rate associated with it. So again, it would have to come from other funds or the current income taxes that are being collected. It's not about increasing the income tax rate, which
Not at
again,
all.
as Jelani says, a little bit more complicated.
Yeah,
Above both our pay grades.
constitutional change, ballot initiatives, yeah, that hasn't been the goal of this work. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much.
All right, let's give Jelani another round of applause. That was a lot. And thank you, President Mahoney, for helping out with the questions. So before we close out today's event, there is a final plug that I'd love to do, and that's on how we continue to support this work. Hopefully, by the end of this, right, you heard the rationale behind the formula. You heard about how it's going to work and how the SIU community is going to benefit, not only students, the institution, but again, the broader community. And so how can you support? there's a few opportunities coming up, and that is we have a campaign currently going on, and that's to connect with your legislators. Legislators need to hear from this community specifically on this issue. So there's an opportunity to send a letter. If you have the availability on April 16th, there's about 300 advocates registered to join us in Springfield and meet with legislators to talk about this issue and other higher education issues, including MAP funding. So again, encourage you, if you are available on April 16th, to join us. And lastly, one of the other things that we're doing is elevating student stories, right, about their experience on campus and the need for more supports and services. But the other thing, the reason why we're here is alumni. You all. There's an opportunity to elevate your story and your interest as well. So I would encourage you, if you are interested, to help us write a blog, right, about those. We have different prompts for alumni specifically, and would encourage you to take us on that opportunity. Please, there's a QR code to follow the coalition and what's next. There's virtual meetings that you can join. Several folks from the different institutions join us, students, student support folks, government relation folks, alumni. So if these are virtual meetings, and I encourage you to attend. Again, a plug for Advocacy Day on April 16th coming up. These are some highlights from last year. And want to encourage you all, if you have ideas on other opportunities that we can share on this work with your community, with the business community, especially with chambers of commerce, with other groups of alumni, please plug us in. These are just some pictures from the other examples of where we've hosted listening sessions, sessions with alumni. So if you have an idea, please reach out to us. We are more than willing to go to your community, talk to people, and share why this work would benefit, again, the broader community. So final plug, an opportunity to write to your legislator. Here's a QR code. It's really easy. It literally takes 2 minutes. So please, if there's one thing you do before leaving here, please scan that QR code and write to your legislator. And I believe that is it. If you have time, I know we're all about the QR codes. There's one last one. We love feedback. So if you have any feedback on today's event, encourage you to let us know. You can also, we'll be outside, and please grab one of us and just let us know your thoughts. If there's something that piqued your interest, like, hey, I want to write a blog, I'm trying to write to my legislator. I have a great relationship with the Chamber of Commerce here. I have a great relationship with Mayor Harvey. Connect us. We need to really tap into that business community especially. So I cannot stress that enough. If you have those relationships, please let me know. The last thing before we end, and Jelani mentioned this, last week the bill was heard, right? And there's something called witness slips. Witness slips are another opportunity for advocates to tell legislators that this is important to them. And so there were thousands of witness slips from advocates across the various campuses. And one of the campuses that we did not see as much was the SIU community. And so I encourage you all that are here, the next time you see an email about a witness slip, please submit one that tells legislators that this is important to you. And if we want to see more revenue come to the institution, to the community, then we need to get this passed this year. And like Jelani and President Mahoney said, there's a lot of momentum. So if we're going to get this done, it's going to happen, but we need you all to join us in those efforts. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for folks who participated through live stream. I hope you enjoyed your evening with us. And if there's still food out there, I encourage you to take some to go. Thank you.